What's up, everybody? I'm back with another long-awaited review, and I'm doing it with a brand new co-star this time. I was supposed to do it with two, but one of my co-stars unfortunately bailed due to personal reasons. I kept having periods of writer's block, and the motivation just kinda wasn't there for a while. However, in the meantime, say hello to SirDuke95.
Hello. This is SirDuke95, and I'm excited to be reviewing for the very first time a piece of Thomas media that I personally grew up with.
So today, we are going to be talking about the very odd Season 6 and 7 release, Thomas and the Jet Engine.
I had this release on DVD as a kid, and it was one of my absolute favorites. However, will this release still hold up as well as it did when I was a kid, now that I'm an adult? Let's find out.
So let's begin with the release history. Thomas and the Jet Engine was first released on VHS and DVD on July 20th, 2004 by Anchor Bay Hit Entertainment. Here's a little fun fact. This DVD was released 2 days after my birthday, right around when I turned 9. But ironically, the DVD wasn't my own copy. It was my brother's first DVD when we first got him into Thomas. A bit of a strange one to start off with, I know. But what's really interesting was that this was the first DVD we had when I first discovered the new DVD menus, where Thomas and the rest of the bunch guide you to where you want to go on the DVD. Personally, I like these much better than the station or map of Sodor menus. Also, this release, along with New Friends for Thomas, are the only ones to contain Season 7 episodes, but with the original Mike and Jr. music, with Michael Brandon's narration. Following the release of Steamies vs. Diesels, the music would be completely rearranged with the Welk and Hartshorn music. But continuing, sometime in 2005, a slim case of Jet Engine was released. I'm not too sure how common these are, since I've personally never seen a slim case pop up anywhere. So I can only assume it must be quite hard to find. Then, Lionsgate had re-released Jet Engine and produced thick cases sometime in 2009. Of course, you can also find the Wooden Railway bonus packs for the VHS and DVD for Jet Engine, which actually, this promo here indicates that a 2006 double feature with Races, Rescues, and Runaways was to be released for the spring with Wooden Railway Caroline, but it is unclear as there are no pictures to prove its existence. Also, Jet Engine can be found in a Playdate 3 DVD pack, as well as the Totally Thomas DVD set and Adventures on the Tracks. Alright, so that wraps it up for the history. So now, let's take a look at the episodes. So Thomas and the Jet Engine features 3 stories from Season 6 and 3 from Season 7, narrated by Alec Baldwin and Michael Brandon, plus a bonus music video. Thomas and the Jet Engine, Percy and the Haunted Mine, Scaredy Engines, Harold and the Flying Horse, Bulgy Rides Again, and Salty Stormy Tale. So let us begin with our first episode, Thomas and the Jet Engine, or Thomas the Jet Engine for those in the UK. Thomas is asked to deliver a jet engine to the airfield, but also wishes he could go as fast as Gordon when the big engine boasts he's the fastest. But Cranky's hook knocks the switch, and the jet engine soon sends Thomas rocketing all over Sodor. Well, for the start of the tape, this episode is pretty damn amazing. Ridiculous as all hell for a story concept, but it's a fun one. I remember when I first saw this episode, and I was blown away by what I saw. Even with the redone version of the William Tell Overture, it makes it more worthwhile. But with that said, I do have a few questions. Like, why does Toppa need a jet engine of all things, and why have it dropped off at the airfield? The hell are they gonna do with it? And I also have to question why Thomas wants to go as fast as Gordon again. If memory serves right, he technically did that way back in Season 1, and it was an awful experience for him. With a jet engine, that's like normal Sonic the Hedgehog speed. Maybe even faster than that.
Gotta go fast. Gotta go fast. Gotta go faster.
But what really gets me excited with this episode is how in tune Alec is telling the story. Sure, it might not be as good as how Angelus does it, but you can at least hear Alec trying to have fun while he's narrating. Small gripes aside though, this episode is still lots of fun. A real pump up for the first episode. I give it a 9 out of 10. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Thomas and the Jet Engine can be summed up with one simple word: exciting. From the second that the jet engine is launched, the writers hit the gas pedal and never let up for the rest of the episode. From the action to the comedy, this episode really delivers. Once again, Mike and Junior used the William Tell Overture, just like they did in Busy Going Backwards. And though many are bigger fans of its use in that episode, I'd argue that it works even better here, because it really amplifies the fun of the situation. Whereas in Busy Going Backwards, there was some peril involved with Toad's runaway. Though a lot of episodes from Season 6 suffer from either poor narration on Baldwin's part or poor writing on the writer's part, this episode does not suffer from either. Baldwin is in top form narrating this story, and you can tell that he's really having a blast.
Uh-oh, said Cranky. Before he could say anything else, the jet engine was rocketing Thomas up the track. Whoa, said Thomas. But Thomas couldn't stop. Whoa, boy! Hi, Gordon. Bye, Gordon.
The writing for Jet Engine is arguably some of the tightest and most streamlined of Season 6. All of the dialogue is kept very simple and straightforward, and this really acts in the story's favor because it allows us to have more time for the action of the jet engine than wasting time on dialogue that goes nowhere, which we may see on another episode in this release.
Hint, it's Harold and the Flying Horse.
All in all, Thomas and the Jet Engine is an epic thrill ride from start to finish. I'd give it a 9 out of 10.
Our second episode is Percy and the Haunted Mine. Percy is to collect a special train from the abandoned mine for the most beautiful station contest. But with the sinking buildings and a mysterious tale of the naughty gnomes, is the mine really as scary as Percy believes it to be? Okay, well, as much as I have a terrible guilty pleasure for this episode, when you really analyze it, it's a mess. An awful mess, if that. It's a pretty stupid story, but I think it knows it's stupid to where it tries to have fun with it somewhat. The episode is filled with so many plot holes, and it just gets worse as you go along. Like, for starters, when the chimney first falls into the ground, how the hell did the crew not hear that? They were only, what, a few feet away? But yet you hear the second building sinking in. Yeah, okay, we'll pretend that makes sense. Second, of all places to collect a freight train, why the mine? It couldn't be brought to, like, the yards or maybe a station or something? It just seems like a very odd place to leave a train, literally in the middle of nowhere. Lastly, explain to me why garden gnomes make a station beautiful. Gnomes in no way, shape, or form are beautiful in any capacity. Especially when they got thick asses like these ones do.
That's hot.
Of course, I must also bring up that this is one of those very few times where Alec is very enthusiastic with the story, especially with the very bland-sounding voices for Donald and Douglas, which is a real shame since Tophams is the only one he puts effort into. I don't want to drag this out any more than I have to, because there's really nothing else I have to say about it. As I said, I do have a guilty pleasure for this episode, but I have to rate this a 4 out of 10. What are your thoughts, Matt?
The word I would use to describe Percy and the Haunted Mine is the same word that Tay used to describe Thomas Goes Fishing. Kooky. However, I don't think this episode is anywhere near as strong as that episode. For one thing, it's riddled with plot holes. And the episode's fixation on garden gnomes being scary has always come off to me as a bit forced. Even as a kid, I never understood why Percy was so frightened of these garden gnomes. They're so bright and colorful and happy looking. However, with that being said, this episode does have some redeeming qualities. Visually, it recaptures some of the magic of the creepier episodes from Season 5, like Rusty and the Boulder and Duncan Gets Spooked, with its gloomy and eerie visuals. The visuals of the building sinking to the ground are quite striking and the most memorable parts of this episode. However, as a whole, it just doesn't pull together. There are more holes in this plot than the mine has. Firstly, how in God's name did Percy's driver not see the first building sink into the ground? To quote Tay, "Are your ears broken?" And if the ground next to the mine is that unstable, wouldn't the heavy freight train sink into the ground as well? This logic isn't even consistent with previous episodes of the show. In Down the Mine, it's shown that the weight of Thomas alone is enough to cause a collapse. These plot holes aside, there is a massive crater amongst all the others. Why would Percy have to collect a freight train from an abandoned mine in the first place? The episode states that the mine is between stations, so why not have an engine deliver it directly to that station, as opposed to leaving it halfway at an abandoned mine of all places? It's abandoned. Nobody's using it. In addition to this, we see the first night that Percy is at the mine, that the train isn't there. And so someone had to have brought the train to the mine in between that first night and the night Percy was supposed to pick it up. I would argue that the mine setting is a very interesting idea for an episode of Thomas, but the way it's utilized in this episode just does not pull together. The garden gnomes just make it too ridiculous. And while it's a memorable episode with some great visuals, the weirdness of the story and the numerous plot holes make this one of the messiest episodes of Season 6. I'd give this episode a 6 out of 10.
Next episode is Scaredy Engines. It's Halloween on Sodor, and Thomas, Percy, and Duck are sent to work at the smelters. Thomas enjoys teasing Percy with the spooky noises and shadows until he eats his own words when he gets a fright of his own. For the first Halloween-based episode of the series, it's another one of many that's both fun and exciting. Once again, that creepy, chilling atmosphere was really touched upon for this story. But with that said, do I think it's better than some of the other spooky-themed episodes we've previously had? Well, not exactly. The story is pretty simple as you can get for a Halloween-themed story. You got your typical background story of some kind of ghost to help set the tone, characters either being scared of said story, then proceeding to get teased, and then said instigator gets their payback. Again, a really simple plotline that I've seen in dozens of other shows. And I know some people, once again, are not very fond of Baldwin's narration here, and some get their draws in a bunch because of the music coming from Duncan Gets Spooked, just at a different pitch. But to be honest, the music change doesn't really bother me. In fact, I actually think it works better here in its favor with the smelter's background. This music, even as a kid, always creeped me the hell out. And while it may not sound entirely perfect, Alec is once again trying to have fun to an extent. And call me crazy, but I think this is another case where he is at his somewhat best. Kinda like how I pointed out in the VHS review of Salty's Secret. What sort of saves this episode in an ironic way is the bonfire and fireworks scenes. Like, when is the next time we are ever going to see beautiful shots as this, or this? All gripes aside, however, this might not be as spooky as some of the Season 5 episodes we've already seen, but whether it's dumbed down or not, I can tell you for a fact, this is easily my favorite episode of Season 6. And I'm ranking it a 10 out of 10. What do you think about this episode, Matt?
The phrase I'd use to describe Scaredy Engines is,
Ooh, spooky.
But in all seriousness, I have a hard time putting my finger on how I feel about this episode. I remember absolutely loving it as a kid, but as an adult, I'm not as enthusiastic about it. For one thing, it's really obvious that they tried to tone down the scary atmosphere created in Season 5's episodes, to the point that it's almost kind of babyish. And for another thing, the writing and narration feels extremely rushed in this episode.
Ooh, spooky.
This problem plagues a lot of Season 6 in general. The production of Season 6 was very messy, especially from a writing standpoint. This comes from HIT's new ownership of the show. A lot of the writing was rushed at the last minute, which is why the quality of the season is much lower than the previous 5 that came before it. For example, Edward's ghost story is extremely simple compared to Rusty's ghost story in Duncan Gets Spooked. It doesn't get past the simple ghost story cliches, and that's why this episode is neither as scary nor as convincing as the episodes of Season 5. More drafts of a screenplay would get past these weaknesses, but the surface-level ghost story that Edward tells indicates to me that they didn't have the time to do so. As I mentioned earlier, Baldwin's narration for the season is also extremely rushed.
Poor Bill, he works, he suffers, while Ben, his twin, gets brand new buffers. Scary Jack Frost, cried James. Ooh, spooky.
Yeah, could we get another take of that, Alec? Like, 20 more takes of those? And this rushed narration exposes the writing's weaknesses even more so. Despite these shortcomings, the music, the visuals, and the atmosphere save this episode for me. That Halloween look just bursts out of every frame in this episode. From the bonfire, to the kids in costumes, to the creepy smelter's yard, that Halloween mood is perfectly captured. Overall, it's one of the most colorful looking episodes of Season 6. In addition to this, the story gag of leaving Thomas at the smelter's yard is just absolutely hilarious, and the gothic vibe of that red lighting and the huge ceilings just creates such a mood and atmosphere that it still gets under my skin a little bit even as an adult. All in all, I'd say that Scaredy Engines has just enough fun in it to make it more of a treat than a trick. I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10.
And the next episode is Harold and the Flying Horse. The vicar is holding an annual garden party and Harold is too busy to join in. He is then called into action when a horse named Pegasus falls into a ditch and airlifts him to the party. I don't really know how many fans feel about this particular episode, but I really don't like it. I think it's a ridiculous story concept in my opinion. With something like Haunted Mine, even though it's a flop, as I said, I can at least get some kind of enjoyment out of it, guilty pleasure or not. Whereas with this, I get literally nothing from it. Seriously, how many people actually talk about this? It's that forgettable. Most of the story is so boring to begin with. It's mainly just Harold whining about not being able to go to the party. Dude, for real? I guess the only nice thing I can say about this episode is that while I know some fans are not fond of Brandon's narration, weirdly enough though, it does work here with the original Mike and Jr. music. What I also get a kick out of is how Percy thinks there is no quote-unquote flying horse. Percy, you ain't seen nothing until you've seen the horses in MLP fly, my friend.
Well, flatten my funnel so horses can fly after all.
But again, these two little things don't say very much to save this episode for me. Also to note, with Harold airlifting Pegasus the way he is, if he was that panicked while in the ditch...
How do we know they aren't scared shitless up there?
There really isn't much else I can say about this other than it's boring, ridiculous, and I don't care for it not one bit. Easily an episode I'd be more than happy to skip over. I'm giving it a 3 out of 10. What are your thoughts, Matt?
Like Percy and the Haunted Mine, Harold and the Flying Horse is another episode centered around a whimsical concept. However, unlike Haunted Mine, which has some fun visuals and memorable moments, Harold and the Flying Horse is just very bland and forgettable. There's honestly not that much good to talk about in this episode. As a kid, I always mixed it up with A Bad Day for Harold the Helicopter because it contained such similar elements, and that's not necessarily the most flattering compliment for this episode. Even for an episode that's more character-focused and driven, this episode doesn't really do much to further Harold's character in the long run. Never again do we see this more sensitive and vulnerable side of Harold that we see in this episode. In addition, the build-up to the horse actually flying is way too slow. We're forced to sit through a bunch of boring and dry exposition scenes explaining flying horses to the engines, and then the horse only flies for about 45 seconds at the very end of the episode, leading to a mediocre payoff. And boy, that horse must be scared shitless to be carried underneath the helicopter through the sky.
There he is, my tiny horse, and he's
In conclusion, I would say that this episode is a very boring, forgettable, and skippable mess. I'd give it a 4 out of 10.
Up next is Bulgy Rides Again. Topham puts Bulgy back on the road when there are fewer engines to work, but things don't go as planned when Bulgy's passengers encounter some frightened hens. If most of you remember when I said Bulgy was one of my least favorite episodes from Season 3, well, this is another case where I kind of feel the same way. It's not bad by any means, but I wouldn't call it fantastic. Like I've mentioned, I personally don't care for Bulgy as a character, however this slight change to him is a bit more amusing than what we saw 4 seasons ago. But with that said, Bulgy being turned into a vegetable stand was an out-of-nowhere curveball, and you'd never think he'd be okay with something like this, given how he was originally trying to steal all the passengers beforehand. And in a way, to me, it was kind of pointless to make a stand out of him, because he just goes back to his old ways many seasons later. Literally the only scene I actually care about is when the hens freak out. It's a bit silly to see the passengers covered in feathers and eggs, which implies that they must have been really frightened to just shout out eggs everywhere. Not gonna lie, that's kind of funny. Even with the nitpicks aside, again, I'm not saying this episode is bad, but I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a favorite of mine. It's just tolerable at most. I'm giving it a 7.5 out of 10. Matt, what do you think about this episode?
Bulgy Rides Again is an episode that I feel doesn't get the attention or love that it really deserves. It's not an action-packed story, but the idea of bringing Bulgy back as a character was such a wild concept for the series to try that it really pays off in the end. Bulgy was kind of a throwaway character in the Railway series. Fun fact, by the way, the reason the Reverend W. Awdry wrote the story Bulgy was to write a story with a subtle metaphor about the evils of communism, if you can believe that.
Yeah, boo snubs!
And that's why Bulgy is red and anti-rail. The Reverend subtly slipped that subtext into the story, hence why Bulgy is called a mean scarlet deceiver in the original story.
He's a mean scarlet deceiver.
But I bet you never noticed that. I didn't notice it until someone told me. While some of the plot points in this episode seem a little forced...
A double-decker problem.
Really? That's what first came to your mind, Thomas? What the And also, the episode's resolution of turning Bulgy into a vegetable stand comes really out of left field. Despite this, I've always found myself drawn to this episode. The story gag of having the hens still think that Bulgy is their henhouse even after he's been restored is such a cute and charming idea, I just can't resist it. And while the character transformation of Bulgy might be an unexpected one, I've always found this episode to be a wild ride worth going on again and again and again, making it one of my favorite episodes from Season 7. I give this episode an 8 out of 10.
And now our final episode is Salty's Stormy Tale. Salty thinks Thomas and Percy are teasing him with the way he speaks, so he leaves to collect Fergus and show him the line. But when a storm causes the lighthouse to short, a ship is in danger of hitting the rocks, and it's up to Salty to save the oncoming ship and crew. This one is what I consider to be one of the best episodes of Season 7. We see here a more sensitive side to Salty, which is a very small pickup in character from when he was first introduced back in Season 6. One might say that Thomas and Percy are a bit degrading due to them being so cheeky, but as pointed out, they think Salty is a grand engine. While that can come off as rude, I think it shows an ample of respect that both engines have towards Salty, which is why all is forgiven in the end. Not saying you should automatically result in copying someone just at random, but you get what I mean. However, what makes this episode so intense is the storm scene. Once again, Mike and Junior really know how to amp things to an 11 with dire situations as this. And Brandon's line delivery within the scene is also amped up a notch. While not overly amazing, it's still pretty damn good. I'd argue that I think this is one of his best narrated stories. Overall, this episode is fun, memorable, and I'll say it again, it is truly one of Season 7's best and easily one of my favorite episodes. I give it a 10 out of 10. Matt, what do you think?
Salty's Stormy Tale is one of the better episodes of Season 7. In terms of character development, this episode stays consistent with the first appearance of Salty in Salty's Secret, which shows Salty as more of a vulnerable kind of character. I really like the depth this brings to Salty. On the surface, you would think that he'd be a kind of gruff, no-nonsense sailor type that wouldn't be bothered by anything. But he's actually the opposite. He's one of the more fragile characters, not mean-spirited, but he definitely has insecurities. That character study in and of itself might be enough to carry a normal episode of the show, nothing too glamorous, but halfway through, the plot and tone changes make this a classic Thomas and Friends episode. The tension of the storm, the lighthouse lamp going out, and the tense music from Mike and Junior present one of the most exciting action-packed sequences in the entire model era of the show. And it doesn't even happen in Season 5, it's a Season 7 episode. It's just so well done. Normally, I wouldn't say that Brandon does a better job narrating than Angelus, but here, he definitely shows a lot more enthusiasm. I don't know if it's necessarily a great performance, but he's definitely more engaged in the story than Angelus is. For example,
Those be dark clouds, matey. There be a fierce storm on the way, Captain. Just in time. Hard to starboard, matey.
a fun story with an epic scale, Salty's Stormy Tale is one that you'll want to hear over again and again and again. I'll give it an 8 out of 10.
And to close off the tape, we have our bonus music video, Boo Boo Choo Choo. Now, I've already explained in my song ranking video that while I think this song is okay at best, it's still one of my least favorites. As I pointed out already, it does sound a bit childlike, which is why I get why some people don't like it very much. And plus, it does have the tendency to freak some kids out, like it did to me all those years ago. However, I have been listening to it a few more times as of recently, and I don't think it's terrible, but it still remains as one of my least favorites. What do you think about the song, Matt?
In the canon of classic Thomas songs written by Mike and Junior, Boo Boo Choo Choo is quite unique. It's the only song that they wrote that had a distinctly creepy tone, and boy, as a kid, it scared the absolute out of me. No, I don't want to know what's that thing moving in the corner, or that shadow across the wall. Just go away, and let me read Junie B. Jones and the Yucky Blucky Fruitcake in peace. But looking back, that's not such a bad thing, being scared, that is, as a kid. I think that scaring kids just the right amount is a good thing because it toughens them up, and this song does it just the right amount. It may sound a bit childish in a few places, but the moral of the song teaching kids to separate their imaginations from what's actually going on is a very important one, and that moral has certainly stuck with me even as an adult. In addition to this, Mike and Junior cleverly weave a well-known spooky theme from the silent film era known as Pizzicato Misterioso in with the Thomas theme at the very beginning of the song to give it that extra Halloween-y flavor. All in all, Boo Boo Choo Choo is a very fun tune, perfect for the Halloween season, and one of Mike and Junior's most memorable songs.
Alright, so what do the both of us think about Thomas and the Jet Engine? Matt, tell us your thoughts.
As a home media release, Thomas and the Jet Engine is quite unique, but not in a bad way. As a kid, I absolutely adored it, and though as an adult I can see that it has certain flaws, I still get a lot of joy out of this release. It has some really memorable and really enjoyable episodes, and I definitely recommend it for your collection.
Well, as odd as this tape is, I don't think it's really all that bad. I mean, sure, give or take, Baldwin still doesn't sound his greatest 100% of the time, and say what you want about Brandon, but his narrations are a little more tolerable here and sound much better with the original music. Whereas if you listen to the newer music and his narrations, it just feels so out of place. For Baldwin's last tape, it was a pretty solid way to send him off. Not the greatest, but solid enough. And as for Brandon, while it does come off as a bit of an out-of-nowhere thing, kind of like what they did with Angelus to US fans, it was a step in the right direction. I think he at least showed a bit of promise as to what we'd expect in the later seasons, but we'll get more into that in his later releases. I wouldn't go so far to say this tape is a favorite for me personally, but I can still get by with it pretty fine. I'm about 50-50 with this one. It's not entirely great, it's not entirely bad, it's just okay, I'd say, generously. If some of you are not exactly fans of either narrator or story on this tape, you needn't waste your time then. However, if there are any of you that like some of these stories, regardless of narration, then I highly recommend getting this tape. And that does it for this review. I want to thank Matt for taking his time to help me out with this little project, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and feel free to check out more of my previous reviews. Link is in the description. So what am I going to do for the next review? Well, with Halloween coming soon, me, Matt, my other co-star Jeremy, and another new co-star are going to be looking at some of the best spooky-themed episodes from Thomas's Halloween Adventures. Just a notice in advance, this will be premiered on Halloween, so make sure you tune in. See you guys next time!